larger society doesn't understand these things. But sometimes when you are a new immigrant and you don't know the language, you don't know the culture, you don't know the values, there's a lot of fear in your mind of even taking the right steps, what might be right vis-a-vis the larger society. And so I think that one of the things I faced, and you still confront with new immigrants, is that they are shy of being assertive, claiming their rights, claiming their rightful place in society. And you almost have to prod them, you have to encourage them, you have to be their support. But he came back with stories that were rather disturbing. People didn't have good water to drink, didn't have places where they could relieve themselves, didn't have any time off for lunch or something, or you could have lunch, but there were no set time. You were doing piecework, and I think there were no health and safety regulations didn't apply to farms at that time, or farm workers. So several years later, as I was at law school, I bumped into a man through BC Federation of Labour who found out that I was interested in these issues and hooked up with me, and he and I and Rami's brother, one of Rami's brothers, we went to the farm. And we called the most notorious farm contractor that we knew and asked him to pick us up. And we were herded into a big industrial van with lots of benches inside, but no real seats and no windows either at the back or on the sides, except the passenger and the driver windows. And the benches had barely enough space for our legs to be bumping against each other. And there was essentially I felt suffocated. I thought I was in hell on wheels. When we were working, we were trying to talk to the farm workers actually more than we were picking berries, because we wanted to know how they were transported, what they were paid. And many of them had said that they hadn't been paid yet for several weeks, and some of them didn't want to work for the contractor anymore, but they were working for the contractor because they realized that if they stopped working, they might not get paid at all. So they were kind of throwing good money after bad to see if they could collect all of it. You see, in those days, the health and safety regulations didn't apply to farms. Labor legislation didn't apply to farms. Employment standards legislation didn't apply to farm workers. So they essentially had no rights. They were in a master-servant relationship. Minimum wage didn't apply to them. And if I'm the farm worker and you're the contractor or the farmer, I'm at your mercy. You'll pay me, not pay me. He would give me basic legal information in English, and I would translate it into Punjabi and then read it on air at the radio station CJVB on Richard Street at that time, long time ago. And I would do that about, I think it was 2.5 minutes twice weekly. I think that was the first time the South Asian community was given basic information without asking for some of the basic legal issues. I think many people were happy. Some people were unhappy. Like I provided information on many issues: landlord-tenant, real estate, wills and estates. But when it came to divorce and family law, that was when the excreta hit the fan, because a lot of people, men in particular, of course, were unhappy that I was providing information to women. Little did they realize that they were listening to the same information, right? But they didn't want women to know their rights. And so I would get threats and calls at home. And it kind of brought home the fact that there are pockets of ignorance in many immigrant communities, and those pockets of ignorance are hard to wrestle, hard to deal with, and they're very resistant to change.
When I arrived in Canada, I actually experienced quite a bit of culture shock myself when I went into the Indian community and visited some of the families. I had come from an urban background in India, traveled around in Indian cities because my father was in the army, and every 3 years we moved to a new place. And when I got here and I went into people's homes, the women would very often, not always, but quite often, be ushered into the kitchen, and you would sit there in the kitchen with other women, and the men would sit in the living room and have their chat separately. Whereas I was used to more of a mixed atmosphere where if somebody came to our house, we all sat together, whether it was men or women, and we would be talking together. There was no segregation of the sexes in that sense. I became quite aware of the lifestyle of women here, and more so through my volunteer work in the schools. The stories from the teachers and sometimes the children that I would be working with would tell stories at home of the abuse that their mothers were suffering. As I got more involved in the community, became aware that many of our women were leading very isolated lives. And some of these cases that happened around us really bothered me. So I would always say, yeah, we should do something. And we then, talking to some of the friends, talking to relatives at home, we decided that we needed to have a women's organization. When India Mahila started in 1973, there were very few services for immigrant women in particular. Whatever advocacy services that were available at that time were mainstream. They had mainstream staff. They had very few women from immigrant communities who could speak their language, who understood their culture. We started going into the community and saying we belong to this organization. People would say, oh yeah, you guys are giving out too much, you're spoiling our women, you're giving them too much information. Or they would say, well, we don't agree with what you were saying, there's no problem in the community at all. Things like that. Our fight wasn't the fight between men and women, it was a fight to get equality and good treatment for women. When we went out into the community and talked about the shelters, told the women, if you need help, this is where you can go. You can call this number, you can go there, you'll have a safe place to stay. And when they actually phoned and went there, sometimes a day later or 2 days later, they'd be scared and they'd want to leave the place and go back to their home, to the same abusive environment, because they didn't feel comfortable in the shelters. They didn't have food that they could eat. They didn't understand the language, and culturally there were some problems there. So very quickly what we did, we made links with the shelters. We said, this is the problem we're facing. This woman came to you, but these are her experiences, and maybe we can together work to see how we can eradicate those problems so that women feel more comfortable when they come to you, and that you feel a lot more comfortable serving them. So what we did was we told them what kind of food they eat, what could they do, if they could have a few lentils, have some vegetables, maybe encourage them to do some cooking over there of their own choice, and they'll be comfortable. And then we made ourselves available to them, that if they needed interpretation, people call us home breakers and they call us troublemakers, because they think by providing information to the women in the community, we're spoiling them and we're breaking the homes. They don't realize that in order to have a strong family, you need both partners to be strong. If you want to have a good, secure environment at home, if you set a good example and role model for your children will learn from that. In the early 90s, we came across a doctor south of the border who was advertising in the South Asian community newspapers, full-page ads talking about sex selections. And he would say, learn the sex of your fetus as early as 8 weeks. And underneath the sentence, he would have abortion information available. So what he was doing was he was trying to target the South Asian community. So we actually organized. First, we phoned the newspapers and said, we would like you to remove these ads from your newspapers because they are promoting sexism, they are promoting the female feticide, and we are against it. And we request you to take the ads. Of course, the newspapers didn't want to remove the ads because they were also making money from those ads. So we ran into roadblocks there. And when they didn't listen, we had to take other steps. What we did was we contacted the politicians, and whenever an election came around, and that happened once, there was a federal election and a provincial election close together, and we contacted all political parties, and we said, we don't want you to place ads in these papers because they carry ads that promote sexism, that promote female feticide, that goes against our principles of equality. And we actually succeeded to a great extent. The newspapers lost a lot of their ads because of our campaign. And eventually they removed the ads from that. But we faced a lot of criticism and front page stories on the newspaper accusing us of various things as well at that time. There are those changes that we see. There is a lot more dialogue and debate in the community on some of these issues. There's a lot more acceptance of the fact that yes, things need to change. People like me and my age group were there almost close to retirement. And I want to see some young blood. I really would urge anybody that, should get involved and extend a hand, join an organization, get out there on your own and do things to bring about change.